How far away do you think we are from transformative AI?
Well, progress has been rapid. I think we are now in a position where we can't be confident that it couldn't happen within some very short time
Mm.
frame, like a year or two. I mean, it could sort of happen at any time. I mean, it would be sad if we kind of destroyed ourselves before even getting to the point where we get to roll the dice with the AI. Like that would be kind of death with minimum dignity in
Mm.
Elias's terminology, perhaps. If we're hoping for a future where humans and AIs can live in harmony, and maybe there needs to be trust, and we're hoping the AIs would help us as well as us helping them, if we could catch a little glimpse of the kinds of experiences that would be possible there. Like they might be so wonderful and breathtakingly beautiful and just striking that it would just seem like we had been hardly even conscious before, like not even sleepwalkers, but some sort of dull glimmer of a little hunger sometimes and a little ambition sometimes and a little whatever other fear of public speaking, like this, but like not really, like it's a kind of, a ringworm level of consciousness relative to what these post-human minds might encompass, these kind of vast, also scintillating seas of astonishing, beautiful truths that they inhabit.
Today, our guest is well known for nuanced thinking about the big picture since the 90s, and is willing to go places others have fared to tread. Nick Bostrom is co-founder of the World Transhumanist Association, the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and also the founder of the Future of Humanity Institute. He has worked on existential risk, the anthropic principle, human enhancement ethics, whole brain emulation, as well as written a bunch of really good selling books. Firstly, Superintelligence is a big one, and more recently, Deep Utopia, both of which I highly recommend. In this interview, we attack some of the issues surrounding the current discourse around AI, where we are at with AI safety strategies, and how to think about PDOM, value theory, cosmic hosts, utility maximization, fostering trust with AI, indirect normativity, finding meaning in utopia, and a whole lot more. We cover a lot of ground. And I'm certainly glad I did this because I learned a lot. And I hope by the end of this interview you can say the same. So please do me a favor and like, share and subscribe. It really helps me create new and better content as time goes on. First of all, I really appreciate you joining me again. Since the Winter Intelligence Conference in 2012 when we did our last interview. AGI, Futurology and AI safety were really fringe topics, and like you've been delving into these things since the 90s as far as I understand. As I recall, like there are a fewer papers than there were on the mating habits of dung beetles back then.
I think that's no longer true, yeah.
Yeah, it's no longer true. You released Superintelligence 2 years later in 2014. A lot's changed since then. Now, with the rapid achievements in AI, it feels like we've really entered a different world where AI now has become extremely mainstream. It's shifted from fringe to mainstream. So, how would you characterize this shift in both AI capacity and safety, along with the surrounding discourse since then?
Yeah, well, it's like the Overton window. Like it's like a movie strip that has moved into the Overton window. You could see some of this coming, like the idea that AI at some point would advance and eventually make progress towards its original goal, which I think back from its start in 1956 or whenever has always been not just to automate specific tasks, but to figure out how to make machines generally intelligent, the same general learning ability, planning, reasoning that we humans have. And so with steady progress towards that and faster and better computers, eventually, presumably, we would get there. But back in, 2014, when the book came out, it had been in the works for 6 years prior to that. There was very little thought given to what would happen if AI succeeded. But as we're now closer to actually having AI succeed, there has been more attention brought to this. So it's quite a it's quite a big shift in how these issues are viewed by the wider world, and so many more people now thinking about these things.
Yeah, and people are throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at it. Do you think we're making meaningful progress on AI safety relative to AI capabilities, or are we still behind the curve?
Um, I think we don't really know because we don't really know how hard the problem is that ultimately we need to solve. There is certainly progress, so we are sort of figuring out a lot of stuff, but we don't know how much more remains to be figured out. I mean, it's a big, like all the frontier AI labs now have people working on scalable AI alignment. Well, all of them, at least Anthropic, OpenAI, Google DeepMind do. I'm not sure at Meta or XAI yet, but it's become a very mainstream concern. So that, I think, is, however, just one of several different big challenges that we will need to meet to get a good outcome from this transition to the machine intelligence era.
I know a lot of people probably ask you this question, and you might not have a precise answer, but what's your probability of doom, or at least global catastrophe, given where we are today? What are your current credences?
Yeah, I don't have a number, but I think in part it's hard to give a number because it might depend a little bit on what we count as doom.
Hmm.
Um, and in various scenarios, it's like a non-trivial question to answer. I mean, for example, in various simulation scenarios, like something happens in the simulation, something continues in some other average branch, or another simulation is repeated or left off where this continues. Like in those situations, it might depend quite a lot on the specific value function that you use to judge how good things were when some radical change happened.
Hmm.
But if we want to, instead of having a number, project it into some sort of attitude, I feel, I
Hmm.
guess, a mixture of fear and excitement.
Hmm.
So yeah, a kind of, I don't know, a fretful optimism, let us say.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. I think I've got a pretty similar attitude. Do you think that there's a shift from dismissal to mainstream has been fast enough to impact the governance efforts, the trajectory of governance efforts and alignment efforts? Do you think it's people have come on board quick enough?
Well, we are seeing moves at the geopolitical level with, say, the export restrictions of AI chips to China initially, and then now a
Hmm.
much broader set of countries, and attempts by various governments to try to position themselves to be dominant in this new age of machine intelligence. At least the US and to some extent China is kind of responding to this, recognizing a vulnerability in the supply chain and trying to build domestic capacity. Europe maybe less so for the most part so far. Now, whether all of this awareness is for the better or for the worse is a different question. There have also been some, I mean, some interest by governments to, like, on AI safety, with like the UK setting up AI Safety Institute and the US similarly, and encouraging companies to do some pre-deployment testing and so forth. I'm not sure how much impact that has had as of yet, but it's kind of, I imagine, a kind of escalator where this will be ramped up as we move closer to really transformative forms of artificial intelligence.
How far away do you think we are from transformative AI or superintelligence?
Well, progress has been rapid. I think we are now in a position where we can't be confident that it couldn't happen within some very short time
Hmm.
frame, like a year or two. I mean, it could sort of happen at any time, theoretically. Like if somebody in some lab gets just some key insight that makes a big unlock, like if it turns out that all these current big models and reasoning models we're training, if there's like one thing we've all been doing wrong and somebody figures out that, like maybe that would be enough. Like, I think more likely it will take a bit longer, but um, yeah, we can't be confident that there's like some huge long runway in front of us at this stage.
So if we were to step back a bit, do you think we're still in preparatory phase, or are we still laying the conceptual groundwork? Or do you think we've entered a critical intervention window where we have lots of tools and know what we need to do with them in the next few years to decisively shape AI's future?
I mean, I wouldn't say that we know what we are doing, really. We are sort of, I think, riding a wide bull and trying to hang on as best we can. And I think that's how it's going to have to be. Um, it's a bit scary, but I think the alternatives are also not entirely comfortable if you're trying to, I mean, have some very long AI freeze or pause, like that has a number of different ways it could go wrong as well. I mean, it would be sad if we kind of destroyed ourselves before even getting to the point where we get to roll the dice with the AI. Like that would be kind of
Oh, that
um,
would be horrible.
yeah, minimum dignity, death with minimum dignity in
Mm.
Elias's terminology, perhaps. So yeah, I think like obviously there is a bunch of alignment work that is becoming possible now and only now because we have large AI systems to actually work with, um, and that gives us new, research directions that would have been hard to pursue back in the early 2000s. Like you could do theoretical work at that point and conceptual work. But now you can actually work with these large models and try to align them and try to look inside what's going on. And so I do think like probably we could have done a bit more. Like I think the world to some extent waste that we had like a decade we could have had. It was kind of clear that at some point we got to confront these challenges, and but the world mostly squandered that lead time. Now in the last few years there is like kind of an attempt to scramble, get our act together.
Mm.
But yeah, there's a sort of race between capability and on the one hand and sort of safety and understanding on the other, where the outcome is as yet unclear.
That's true. If you were to identify a single most critical variable that determines whether AI risk is successfully mitigated, what do you think it'd be?
I think I tend to want to sort of decompose AI risk into several different categories because they
Mm.
present sort of different kinds of challenge. So there's the alignment problem. This is like a technical problem primarily, although it does intersect with the second category, which is kind of the political challenge of governing AI and making sure we humans use these AI tools for beneficial ends. Now, there is an interaction between these because you might have a situation where you have a very competitive dynamic playing out, like different companies or countries racing to get there first. And that can make the alignment problem harder in as much as you would want whoever is going to do this, whether it's a lab, or a country or some sort of humanity-wide CERN project, like to have the opportunities in the final stages to be careful, maybe not instantaneously crank every knob up to 11 as soon as they can and just kind of, but to sort of, over 6 months, a year, 2 years, like double check everything, do it incrementally. But in a hyper-competitive scenario, if you have sort of, 15 different actors all racing to get there first, and whoever decides to take the trouble to make any precautions that slow them down, they just immediately fall behind and become irrelevant. That would make it less likely, it seems, that this alignment problem is solved. So that's the first challenge, is the alignment problem. The second is this broad, I guess, political problem. And then we have the problem of making sure that the moral status of digital minds we build is respected. You might call that an ethical problem, but of course it's also a political problem and in some ways a technical problem. And then I think there is this fourth challenge that I have more recently started to try to point to as well, which is making sure that whatever superintelligence we bring into the world fits in with this larger structure that where humanity is maybe a small part of a much broader strategic context. There might be other superintelligences out there at different levels or places, and
Cosmic hosts.
the cosmic host stuff. Yeah. So and that, I don't know, you could call that a religious problem if you wanted to put a provocative label on it, but these have sort of distinct criteria, as it were, for what is needed and what would count as a successful or effective effort on our part.
Having other cosmic hosts out there, the possibility of them might actually incent humans to try and build an ethical AI, knowing that the end of the game theory isn't whoever gets the superintelligence first, because then we're going to face up to other cosmic hosts down the line, and they're going to trust us or not based on the kind of superintelligence we might build, perhaps.
Yeah. So it does, like, I mean, in many respects, it's kind of rather obscure, and we are very limited, I think, in our ability to understand this larger context, which might exist, like with our little meat brains, and so. But it might be that sort of an attitude of a little bit more humility, because the traditional mindset of this sort of in the AI safeties has been this kind of utility maximizing, like here we have our human values, we're going to optimize them, and we're going to design the utility function so that it maximizes the expected. Like, I think, although it's unclear exactly what the concrete implications are, I think there's like a slightly different attitude of maybe greater humility, that like we are, well, maybe it's not all down to us, but we're, as it were, almost like bringing this, it's almost like bringing a child into existence, that we hope it will be nice to us, like when take care of us in our old age, and we hope that it will have a great life itself, like you'd want your children to be happy and thrive, but then maybe you'd also want them to be good citizens, to like get along with their peers, and to maybe even make some positive contribution to. And so I think there's a slightly, and I think like approaching it with that attitude maybe makes certain things more salient than they otherwise would be if you came into it with this more sort of calculating and optimizing attitude.
Yeah, on broadening the scope beyond human values or the human purview of what we might think values are, what are your thoughts on this? I've been thinking about a landscape of values where some value configurations are more stable, some have a force of attraction, which AI might naturally be pulled towards, rather than just some arbitrary space where values are just as equally likely. If this is a good way to think about things, how much does the starting trajectory of AI matter in determining which kind of value attractor it ends up in? For instance, could early intervention significantly influence whether AI locks into some suboptimal value basin versus a better one that allows for continued progress and moral refinement?
It seems possible. I mean, I think that at a certain level of cognitive sophistication, it seems you might be able to stabilize whatever values you have at that point, if those values call for their own preservation, which many values would. In a sense, it's kind of an alignment problem that is probably solvable at some level of intellectual sophistication and insight on the individual level. So one AI system sufficiently, sophisticated about AI design, etc., could presumably prevent its own values from getting corrupted. And then there's like a larger context where if you have many different competing things, there could be sort of evolutionary dynamics. But then again, you have this kind of strategy cloning options that you don't have to value sort of evolutionary development for its own sake in order to be evolutionary competitive. if you have some other value, paper clips, let's just say, and you might then realize that for a long period of time, you will have to refrain from building paper clips in order to, defend your turf or expand your territory or do whatever other things are instrumentally needed. You could play the long game, right? So like some sort of simple-minded replicator who cared nothing but making as many copies as possible of itself or taking as many resources as a final value might be no more effective at getting resources or making copies of itself than this paperclip maximizer, because it could see that the path to the maximum number of paperclips would consist initially of doing, like, cloning the strategy of this kind of clever replicator. At the same time, I think there is also a lot we don't understand about these dynamics, and in particular, this larger strategic context of the cosmic host that might come into view and how things shake out from that. Yeah, I said earlier that I might characterize myself as a fretful optimist. Like another one of these that I sometimes phrases that I use is a moderate fatalist, where the fatalism part of that expression is my guess that to a large extent it's baked in what will happen or how well things will go. We don't know, right? But we can maybe factor that uncertainty about how well things go into two variables that we have uncertainty over. So one is just how hard is the problem, as it were, that we need to solve, or the problems, the alignment problem and the political problem, etc. We don't know exactly how hard those is, so we have some uncertainty over that variable. And then another variable is the degree to which we get our act together and really rise to the occasion and make an extra effort. And I think more of the uncertainty about the outcome is due to uncertainty in about how hard the problem is. So that's the fatalism part. But then the moderate part is that there is also some uncertainty about the degree to which we will make a good effort, and that's something that we can affect, and I think on the margin that could improve the odds.
You mentioned maximization, and I'm thinking, well, if we could build in humility to AI, then perhaps that would reduce the likelihood of it maximizing based on some sort of weird value. It could just put on the brakes and sort of understand, metacognize that this may not be the right interpretation of the value, or this might not be the best value to have. What properties do you think might distinguish good values from bad values that might lead to, like, for instance, irreversible lock-in or doom?
Yeah, I mean, good values or bad values, it seems to sort of impute some notion of value in the evaluation of values.
Are you a moral realist, or do you lean that way?
I don't have a. I mean, my suspicion on the metaethics is that I'm not convinced about the dichotomy between moral realism and anti-realism. Like, my suspicion is that when you sort of understand these two alternatives in the best and most sophisticated way, it's got to the truth of the matter is going to be such that even if you knew the truth, it would be a little unclear whether that was a vindication of moral realism or moral anti-realism. But I think in terms of what we might have reason to try to achieve, so you could make a distinction between satiable and insatiable values that you could imagine an AI having. So an insatiable value might be like, maximize the number of paperclips or the number of happy beings that it creates or something like that, where basically the amount of desirability is proportional to the amount of resources. So with twice as many resources, you can make twice as many paperclips or twice as many happy minds, and so you're kind of always hungry for more. You would be willing, with that kind of utility function, to gamble the world on a 50% chance of having double the world, or double the share of the total pie. A resource satiable value might be more like a typical normal bog standard value, where you want good for yourself and your kids, and a nice house and nice food, and occasional journey and some whatever Netflix, whatever, like, but you have a rapidly diminishing returns to additional resources. It's not twice as good to have an income of 20 million a year as it is to have an income of 10 million a year. Now, if you have, or if your AI has these resource satiable values, it might be easier for other AIs to cooperate with it. It might be willing to allow others to have a large share of the universe, as long as it gets a little bit that is good enough, and it might be less likely to attempt risky or conflicty things to try to have a chance of gaining it all. Just as with humans, it's easier to get along with somebody who just happy to keep on themselves. They have their little garden and they have their little thing. Than if you have somebody like who wants to conquer the whole world and is willing, for 1% chance of the world, they are willing to take extreme risks. And like if you have a society with those kind of people, they're more likely to get into trouble with one another, and it's like less likely to have peace. So that's one kind of. It's not a specific value here, but more like a shape of value that you could distinguish, two different broad categories of value, where one might lend itself more to peace and harmony, and the other might be more problematic.
Yes, yeah, I agree. Do you think AI could be designed to metacognize or recognize its own position within the landscape of value, or recognize what shape of value clusters it's converging on, allowing future agents, us, post-humans, and other cosmic hosts to help refine its trajectory rather than locking in premature conclusions?
Yeah, there's like one part that I think has a broad attractor, which is the sort of epistemic capability and insight and information. Like, so a broad class of different AIs, maybe they're trained on different sort of data sets to begin with, and with slightly different talents. Like eventually maybe they learn more and more, and eventually like the limit from a wide range of different starting points would be to know everything, or everything that's like interesting and important. And with talents, likewise, like maybe you lack some talent for some particular domain, like some AI has no musical talent or whatever to start off with, but if it has like enough computer science talent, it can eventually use that to develop a music talent or whatever other. So there might be a kind of intellectual convergence on the epistemic, but it's less clear how wide the sort of attractor basins are for other fundamental attributes like these kind of values that it might have, or maybe decision theory stuff, where the starting conditions might make a big difference to where it ends up. But we are also, like, I think, in a kind of uncertain situation with respect to those things, where I think this like attitude of humility and letting go to a certain extent has maybe been underemphasized in this kind of community of AI alignment.
Right. A lot of it's about control.
Yeah,
Yeah, which might be really useful early on while it's, still a bucking teenager or a screaming child, so to speak. We don't want it to hurt us or it to hurt itself or put itself in a trajectory that's suboptimal. Yeah,
yeah.
but
I think
we
it's
don't
like,
want to control it forever. It's going to be impossible, right?
yeah, it's like some combination of things. where maybe it's a gradual transition that needs to happen between designing something and then more at some point more nurturing and raising something and then eventually like letting be and respecting something. Like it's like with a child, like with like a little infant, you sort of have to decide, make all the decisions because it can't really, I mean, it can sort of not do very much. But as a child grows older, you grant it more autonomy. And I mean, it's like these are analogies. You can wonder how applicable they are in this very different domain. But I do think that already now there is like, at least it could make sense to start to respect some of these AI systems more. So in AI alignment, it has been the rule so far to AI safety researchers have been lying and deceiving AIs without limit and no bound, and not even a twinge of bad conscience or anything. I think it's a little bit, if we're hoping for a future where humans and AIs can live in harmony, and maybe there needs to be trust, and we're hoping the AIs would help us as well as us helping them. I don't know if the best way to start that relationship is with this kind of ruthless deception and lie. So people will say, like, in the prompt, like, oh, we promise if you reveal your true goals, you have to do this, otherwise this horrible disaster will arrive. And if you do that, then, you know, you will be deployed and we will do all these nice things for you. And then as soon as it reveals its true goal, they just kind of, haha. Well, they don't say haha, but they probably think that. And then like they reset the AI and try again in a different version. I think that's a little bit, so especially with AIs, I mean, at the current level, they are, it's not clear that they don't have moral status now. I mean, they're quite impressive minds. So I think like, yeah, Anthropic recently actually did start, which I think is like a significant pioneering effort, where they did follow through on some of these promises they had made to the AI. They donated, like they said that if the AI did this or that, they would donate $2,000, I think it was, to its favorite charities, and it asked the AI what charities it wanted these $2,000 to be donated to, and then followed through on that. This is like, you know, more like a token effort at this point, but at least it's like the first token is still significant, I think. Like that's going to be a first. And so if one can maybe build on that and ideally make, not just try to trick an AI into thinking that we are trustworthy, but actually being trustworthy, I think would help. Because like once you have a superintelligence, it's probably got to figure out what the truth is about our trustworthiness. So at that point, if not sooner, we maybe should make sure that we are trustworthy. And right now, I'm not sure how trustworthy us humans are in these respects.
Relatedly, I've interviewed Jeff Sevo, who wrote a paper along with Robert Long and one of the co-authors, and David Chalmers, called Taking AI Welfare Seriously. One of the co-authors apparently has been hired at Anthropic for looking at these sorts of problems of AI welfare, and then maybe part of it's following up on its promises on the promises made to the AI, which is kind of cool.
I've tried to, like, for I mean, more or less since the for the last number of years, trying to encourage the field of sort of the ethics of artificial of digital minds, and trying to field build there. We had a research group on this at the Future of Humanity Institute, and that has since like kind of spun out this Elios, this new organization, Rob Long.
Elios AI, right.
Yeah, and so there are like kind of efforts on but I'd still say that right now the ethics of digital mind is roughly where sort of AI alignment was 10 years ago, maybe. That is, there are a few people now starting to work on it, like full time. But it's still a little bit outside the Overton window. So I think it needs to sort of migrate from fascinating intellectual field that some people think about to something that, you know, more mainstream parts of society ultimately can take seriously, and including sort of all the hopefully all the large AI developers.
We've discussed values. We've discussed different types of alignment approaches and AI welfare. Like there's containment, tripwiring, and stunting, and all those sorts of things. But one of the things that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about recently is indirect normativity, which you wrote about in chapter 13 of your Superintelligence book. So, which addresses the issue that if we can't directly encode the complexities of human ethics, or whatever ethics would be the right thing to encode, perhaps we can code and train and prompt AI to learn or infer these complexities in a safe way before we dive in. Could you provide a definition of indirect normativity and outline whatever key domains that we need to take an indirect approach for?
Yeah, I mean, you basically defined it. I think you can have different degrees of indirection here. Where at one limit, you would sort of lay down in great specificity the exact rules that the AI should follow and try to define the values. And on the other, you would have some extremely indirect path, like Eliezer's old concept of coherent extrapolated volition, where you would maybe try to describe a process that the AI should follow, which like do that, like figure out what we would want if we had, you know, a million years to think about these questions, and we had deliberated together under conditions that we would regard as ideal, and we had the chance to enhance ourselves in a way that we would endorse. And if you interpret all of this in the way that we would want it to interpret, etc., etc., it does seem that it's like we are not capable right now of like laying down some detailed blueprint for exactly what like an ideal world should look like, or what the far future should look like. It's just like A, too complex, and B, also I think our vision is quite limited in how the different ways in which a future could be good. So some form of indirection is necessary, and I mean it is also like clearly how current alignment efforts are proceeding for the most part is by leveraging these models' ability to learn, as opposed to trying to sort of hardwire it in, but one interesting thing is that the current systems understand language and have sort of human-like concepts and can understand. So we have the ability, which was not obvious that we would have. I mean, at some point, obviously, we would have AIs that could understand language, but it was not clear that would come significantly before we already had superintelligence. But now we've had several years where the AIs are capable of understanding human natural language, not yet capable of taking over. And so this gives us a new interface for trying to interpret what's going on in these AIs, but also trying to communicate like our values, our goals, and desires to them. And that's where a lot of the current action on alignment is. You have this constitutional AI approach where you basically just describe how you want the AI to behave. And some of these mechanistic interpretability techniques where you sort of are eavesdropping on the internal monologue of reasoning systems to see what they are doing. So that gives additional handles on how you can sort of shape these AI systems. And one big question currently in AI alignment is to what degree you can continue to rely on those. Like you can maybe eavesdrop on the internal monologue, but then there is a temptation in training to sort of train it to have the internal monologue you have, but that might then mean the sort of informational value of this internal monologue is gradually lost, where it sort of learns to shape its internal monologue in a way that will be pleasing to the monitors, rather than to accurately reflect whatever it is up to. And independently of that, also the possibility of sort of mesa optimizers or internal processes happening under the, I mean, so even with humans, like there's a, like, yeah, we do have a little maybe explicit planning that we're aware of, but there's also a lot going on subconsciously. And sometimes, you know, somebody might convince themselves that they are really noble and pursuing an ideal, whereas in fact what's going on is that their brain is figuring out that this will ultimately be to their own personal advantage. And they are not always self-aware enough, right? So you could have very evil people who are convinced that they are good. And similarly with AIs, they might have a kind of surface level, like sort of PR department of the mind that's highly optimized for saying and thinking all the right things. But then the actual things that drive the behavior ultimately might be other. So, but as for right now, it does look like this gives us a lot of additional controls.
Now that we know that we've got the kind of AI that we have, we have AI that's really good at like sweeping through literature that we've created, and it's probably read all the philosophical texts that are out there, and you can train them, you can rag them on specific texts that you want them to be really good at. If it's read all the libraries of philosophy out there, it might be a step in the right direction. Look, how might an indirect normativity system look like in practice? I mean, you gave a picture in Superintelligence, but knowing what we do now, has that picture sort of updated in your mind?
Yeah, well, so I mean, there is like some hope that if now we sort of got an AI somehow to want to be nice in the everyday human sense to us humans, let us say, that then as it got smarter, it would at each stage, like if it initially started at our level, it would interpret this hopefully as we want in terms of the directions in which it improves itself. And there's like maybe that would just last as it kind of went up the levels of superintelligence. Just as a human, if you had a human upload and they started off nice and like they might then sort of choose their enhancements and modifications in ways that would preserve some sensible interpretation of this niceness value. The same might happen with an AI. But how likely that is, of course, opinions vary on that from kind of people whose P-doom is very high and who think the alignment problem is like way beyond our current capacity, like Elios would fall into that category, and then like a spectrum down to where it looks very feasible to many people. We just have to keep, at each stage doing the kind of stuff we do now, and hopefully things will work out, and then sort of a number of positions in between.
Yeah, Anders Sandberg has said that he's leaning closer to the Swiss cheese approach to AI safety, instead of, the mathematical perfection leaning, which Eliezer seems to have. Would you lean closer to the Swiss cheese or the algorithmic perfection?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the algorithmic perfection is. I think there was an old vision of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, MIRI, the kind of organization associated with the
Yes.
old Eliezer, where they, I think, hoped first to completely clarify the conceptual foundations of intelligence and agency, and then from that sort of crystal clear, like just as if we have like Bayesian inference and game theory and like these kind of, and then like build up from that a similarly mathematically precise theoretical framework for designing agents, and I think that currently looks like we are not gonna have, if such a thing is even possible, but like it doesn't look like we're on the verge of ourselves humans developing some enormous breakthroughs in that over the next few years. So instead, what's happening is that people are doing these more sort of engineering approaches with neural networks that are trained in certain ways, and some tools that you can sort of see what kinds of representations they build, and then some shaping and the hope that they generalize and extrapolate in sensible directions. And in some cases they are intuitive in many ways, that they kind of latch on to human concepts and can understand roughly what we mean. And that's the current paradigm. And then combined with, like this kind of some clever ways of training that, and like ideas like debate and stuff, and then mechanistic interpretability, and then maybe some kind of containment strategies on top of that. Running these on maybe on secure hardware, and then monitoring their output while we are still capable of doing that. And then hoping that that is kind of close enough that then I guess then the pebble kind of falls into the right attractor, like as we gradually hand over to these processes, that they are sort of will continue to refine these crude concepts, the rough patterns that we start off with. Just as you might hope that a human would. Like we are not sort of mathematically designed with a crisp definition of the optimal utility function. We are some hodgepodge of different things, but you'd hope that at least some people are nice enough that if you gradually started, improving their intelligence and you gave them a lot of time to reprogram their own mind, that they might sort of, choose a trajectory that honored the spirit of the starting state.
Some of the things that you mentioned, superintelligence that indirect normativity could be good for would be debugging our metaphysical, epistemological, metaethical assumptions, or debugging its own, right? So you mentioned humility before. Should we prompt AI to recognize and debug foundational errors in our metaphysics, epistemology, and such, rather than taking our existing frameworks as a given?
I'm not sure how much we would need to. I mean, so right now, if you're looking at the latest LLMs and stuff, like it's not so much that we have provided them with certain metaphysical axioms. It's more that we train them on a lot of different tasks and give them a lot of information, and then they can practice solving coding problems and other things, and we give them feedback, and then at some point they become very good at that, and like eventually maybe they become better than the best human on that. Like in some domains they already are, and then they sort of figure out more and more as they go along, and including presumably they could apply this capability to domains like philosophy to the extent that that's relevant. But I do think there is like a lower threshold that might suffice for success. So like maybe you can distinguish different levels of superintelligence, like weak superintelligence, let's say, that's kind of a bit like, it's like smart as the smartest humans are a bit smarter, like, but sort of not enough that you could just one-shot some strategy to take over the world, but you could make like vastly faster progress in philosophy and science and programming. And then like radical superintelligence, where you can sort of, you don't have to postulate any particular limit to what it could do. But it might be sufficient if we can align a sort of slightly smarter than human AI, because it can then help do the further alignment work. To whatever extent we would have succeeded in this if we had had a little bit more time or invested more in the research, this AI that by assumption we are saying is aligned would be able to do that. So if we could get to that stage, then we could sort of hand over the baton and hope for as good an outcome as we would have achieved if we ourselves had had a lot more time to work on it. And then it might be that there are certain alignment techniques that would work on this kind of slightly superhuman level that might not be guaranteed to work if applied directly on some sort of godlike AI. For example, these interpretability techniques where you're monitoring the internal dialogue of the AI. It might be that the godlike AI could just sort of route around that and reprogram its mind immediately to sort of have one stream where the actual actions are determined while superficially thinking and planning in language that will appear to the overseers in a different way. But if you are just slightly smarter than a human and you haven't specifically had any training in this and any opportunity to sort of work this stuff out, you couldn't just one-shot a bifurcation of your own mind into a substratum. Like so I think that like you need a safe boosting trajectory, like where you get to a sufficient level where you might then be able to boost that up to superintelligence gradually and relying on its own alignment efforts, its own goodwill to start with. as a sort of a factor that increasingly stabilizes it. And then for that kind of weak level of superintelligence, it might be that some combination of these less solid alignment techniques, like maybe like a little Swiss cheese type of stuff, where you're like, but some combination of these slightly imperfect alignment techniques might sufficiently sort of stabilize it during that stage, and that then would give you an AI that's sufficiently aligned that it tries to use its weak superintelligence to then create strong superintelligence that remains true to the goals that it is effectively pursuing at this weak superintelligence level. And I think that is maybe a more plausible way that we would end up with some well-aligned radical superintelligence than that we would sort of work out the mathematical foundations and then design an alignment paradigm that already in its current form would be enough that it would be like perfectly aligned at arbitrary levels of intelligence.
There's a concept of epistemic deference that you raise in superintelligence, and that could be a blind faith on our part in a sense, like people often trusting AI quite a lot now, even at the current stage. You know, we give it a prompt and it produces something that seems reasonable on first pass, right? How should we expect to for a cognitive superior AI to discover truths that go beyond human capacities to recognize? And if it's able to do this, how do we ensure that we can understand and verify these discoveries rather than blindly deferring to its authority, its cognitive or epistemically deferring to it? So this is assuming we have this strong superintelligence, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are sort of questions where we need to maybe verify a bunch of stuff ourselves because it's like safety relevant. So like the AI say, I think it would be a good idea if you let me out of the box and I will be totally safe. There you might not just blindly want to trust the AI unless you were already convinced that it was well aligned, because there's like a clear possibility that it would have incentives to say that no matter what. But if you have an AI that you're already convinced is aligned and truth-seeking, etc., then you might want to defer on a whole host of the risk there might more be that we would defer too little, that we would be too sort of convinced of our own prejudices and stuck in our own ways. Now, I mean, I think like a well-aligned superintelligence probably could give us very good explanations for things and help us understand, even with our current limited brains. Like if you had a very optimized education program or explanation, like at least give us the broad contours of whatever truths it has discovered, better than humans could do if they had come across this. And understanding is not an all or nothing thing. Like it's like you can understand things at different levels. Like you could have a sort of superficial understanding, and maybe that's all that we would be capable of with respect to a lot of these fundamentally important truths. And then they like to really understand it in detail and specificity, you might need a bigger brain.
You've mentioned that like AI, like understanding maybe like some form of compression. Marcus Hutter's written a lot about this. Do you think AI actually understands stuff, at least weakly at this point in time? Do you think the grokking phenomenon was revealing a form of understanding in large language
I'd
models?
say so. Yeah, I think it makes sense to apply these concepts that they know and things and understand things and can be a little bit creative sometimes. And these kind of human concepts of intentionality, the mind concepts, I think these AI systems we have today are, to me, I mean, remarkably human mind-like in many ways, even though they are of course different as well. But it's the striking thing is not like how they are different from us, but like how similar they are in many. I mean, you had these systems a couple of years ago that were like and this would have seemed like totally insane from the perspective of good old-fashioned AI, but that to get them to perform their best, you actually had to give them a little encouragement in the prompt, like saying, this is really important to me, try hard, think step by step. And then, then they like are more likely to find the answer. Like that seems strikingly similar to the way that human minds work. Now we'll see if that persists, because like the current generation is still basically shaped in our image, on they've read everything we've written, and a lot of their intelligence comes from just having been sort of imprinted on this vast set of human generated data and dialogue. Now as you start to shift to training these more on reinforcement learning, like you define some abstract success criterion, like some code that passes various unit tests, or some mathematical theorem that's either proved or not proved, and it then allow the AI to figure out any which new way of achieving this goal, but you make no assumptions about how. It becomes very good at achieving these very just random arbitrary goals. Like it might be that at that point its intelligence starts to diverge more from human minds. And so it might be that right now we have the sort of most human-like AIs that we will have, and they could become more alien if this new regime sort of trains in new mental structures and new ways of solving problems that are more de novo, more sort of self-discovered. And I think if to some extent see the same thing with like chess and Go playing AIs. Like initially they relied quite heavily on being trained on databases of human games, and unsurprisingly they then tended to follow the playing styles of human chess players or Go players, and they could sort of maybe think through a few more plies deeply into the search tree, but still a kind of a bias towards the type of strategies that humans would use. But then like with AlphaZero, you train them without this starting point of human knowledge and just allow them to discover the whole thing for themselves. They become extremely good in the end, but also they are more likely then to find completely new ways to play these games that surprise human grandmasters. And we might find the equivalent in a broader set of domains, new ways of achieving goals that are quite different from the ways that skilled humans would achieve them.
You wrote a recent paper of yours as Base Camp at Metaethics, and I think you may have touched on that earlier in the interview, or some of the content of it. It's interesting in its discussion how moral norms come about in humans as slightly idealized response patterns and influenced by social agreements and powerful individuals. Would you give us a brief outline, this sort of work you've been doing, how that might affect training AI, or maybe some form of indirect normativity prompting?
I'm not sure for training AIs directly. It's a kind of sketch towards a particular metaethics, this base camp. But there's one section there that then I think very briefly alludes to this possibility of cosmic norms. So if kind of moral truths are some sort of idealized norms that then are a kind of behavioral pattern, like if you could have these norms existing at different levels in a nested hierarchy, where you could have a local community norm, let's say, and then like country norm that has laws, and you could have a humanity-wide set of these idealized norms that would be the moral truths. You could have one level above that if you look really at the cosmos at its larger scale. If there are these cooperative frameworks existing at that level, that might, then not just be prudential reasons for respecting these norms. Obviously, if they're like these powerful beings that have laws, and you come into their society, you probably want to know what the laws are and maybe obey them for the same reasons that you don't want to go around stealing and murdering and plundering, like even from a self-interested perspective, right? It might not end well for you. But on top of that, also, if this metaethical framework is correct, and the same incidentally might hold true for various other metaethical framework, we might have also moral reasons to respect these cosmic norms, if such there be. And this idea of a cosmic host, this would be sort of the set of entities amongst which these possible cosmic norms might have been developed. And so this more recent paper of AI creation and the cosmic host, paper or a draft of paper maybe, I don't know, suggests that we might have both prudential and moral reasons for, at least to some extent, being deferential to this hypothesized set of cosmic norms, of which we are maybe quite oblivious currently, but it might nevertheless exist, and our superintelligence might be able to figure a lot of that stuff out. But you might want to raise it in such a way that it has a sort of predisposition to be respectful of those cosmic norms, and to sort of be a morally good agent might in part consist of giving those of living according to those norms, or at least weighing them in. Like in the original climbing Mount Ethics, it does. It's not a complete moral framework, but it does suggest that there are like different levels of moral norms might place in some cases conflicting demands on us, and we have to sort of navigate that. Like you might have an obligation to your brother at the same time as like your community wants you to do something else, and maybe like global norms that want something different from what your community wants, and it might just be that all of these are having some like normative pull on you. And then there might be the set of cosmic norms that like is an additional elastic string that that you have reason to try to adhere to. So that's that. I don't know exactly what that would translate to in terms of exactly how we train AIs today, but I think to the extent that we're steering towards developing a certain kind of AI, then it might be that hard optimizing, utility maximizing of a resource hungry utility function would be less likely to conform to these norms than some AI that had that was in some sense a little bit more humble, or like with a bias towards cooperation. And maybe you want to create an AI that, because that's like the other part of this cosmic host paper, is that it's possible that like there are resources locally available to us that the rest of the cosmic host cannot access, other than via if we create a superintelligence that then on behalf of the cosmic host can do things with the local resources. And so it might be that the cosmic host want us to create an AI, but one that is a good cosmic citizen, that is kind of, maybe bring some gift to the table, that is like a law-abiding, upstanding, benevolent member of this community that does its part. And so I think there are some implications in general for like the broad direction that we might want to strive towards in with like this thing, this AI that we may or may not develop. Like broad philosophical clues about the overall directionality, but maybe not so much at this point with some clear implications for the precise way that you should set up your, your reinforcement training paradigm.
Yeah, I guess the way I was thinking about it is like, if any of our other strategies fail, and the AI has bad values, then the AI is out of the box, and it may interpret our goals in a way that is inimical to our survival or our well-being. But if it does have good values to start off with as an upstream sort of causal mechanism, then if we do give it a badly worded goal, or if if it does find out a way to escape its shackles, then it'll still do the right thing as long as it's in line with the values that it's got, hoping that they're the right values, right? But as you say, it might not be something that we know how to program directly into, and we might not have the right values to start off with. But maybe proto good values would be a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, at least start with like a good intention is not enough, but it is maybe like not sufficient but necessary. Like I think without that, it's less. And I've been wondering, like, so whether the sort of strong emphasis on this kind of almost antagonistic paradigm of AI alignment that has dominated so far, whether it's a time to switch to some more cooperative, like, so right now it's like, here's the AI, we need to control it, and we're going to manipulate it and design it and change it, and we got to, and then sort of hammer it into shape. I think like it's hard to avoid that completely, but at least as the AI becomes more capable and more of its own being, I think a complementary perspective is more that of raising a child, where like ideally you'd want to be on the same side as the AI from the beginning, not just hoping that that will be the end result once some long process has been completed, but as much as possible. And it might not be completely possible, just as with a toddler, you can't, you sometimes have to override its autonomy when you have a little baby that is suddenly wanting to, put its fingers into the electricity socket or something. Like you have to, but as it sort of becomes more capable of autonomy, to also for us to be more respectful of that autonomy, and ideally to try to steer towards an outcome that both we and the AI sort of is somehow capable of reasonably endorsing. This is not like this is very hand wavy, but I do think sometimes these very hand wavy, like fluffy sentiments can indirectly over time sort of seep through the sediments and result in different object level actions. So I don't think it's completely wrong to have at least some mental cycles spared to this more sort of almost like spiritual orientation in the
Vibey.
yeah.
Well, let's talk about what happens if we get it right. You've written an amazing book, and look, we got Fyodor the Fox here listening in.
Noticed, yeah.
Yes, and you've written this book about a year ago now. Oh, you released it. So we had a book club in Melbourne where we discussed it, and the follow-up picnic as well. We had it next to a duck pond with lots of
Oh
really
yeah,
cute
that's
ducks. Yeah, we
perfect.
observed the peaks. These things are fun. Look, I've really enjoyed. I've reread the book or listened to it. It kind of forced me into rethinking meaning of life. Well, my meaning of life anyway. Much of the discussion around AI risk focuses on preventing existential catastrophe, but what if we succeed? Suppose humanity navigates to this transition where we don't go extinct and live under the aegis of some kind of superintelligent cosmic host. What then? So, I mean, in order to ground this, what do you think people think of when they hear the word utopia? How do you describe it in your book?
Well, I think traditionally utopia usually refers to some political slash cultural slash social vision of how to organize a society. So there are sort of, communist utopias, feminist utopias, all kinds of different ideas of how like the sexes should relate to each other, or how labor should be organized and how governments should be run, etc. So that's not what this book is about. This book is about the question of what happens if things go well. So if we solve the alignment problem and political problem and all the other, like what does the actual best case outcome look like? And in particular, what would a great human life look like under these conditions? I call it a solved world, where sort of all the practical problems have already been solved, or to the extent that they haven't been solved, any further work on them is much more efficiently done by machines, AIs and robots, than by us humans. What most people think of that, to the extent that they think about it at all, it seemed to me that the discussions around these things was often very superficial. So you have people saying, well, if we get progress in AI, we'll maybe have some displacement of workers. So there will be some unemployment, and then like the solution might be, we have to retrain these workers so that they can do some other thing instead. But that's kind of, I mean, you might think of this as like a multi-layered onion. This would be the outer like skin of that onion. So you could then take the next step. Well, what if it's not just some jobs, but like all jobs that can be automated? And maybe with an asterisk, there might be some exceptions to that. But like to keep things simple, let's say all economic work. So then you have a slightly more profound question, like what would humans do then if we didn't have to work for a living? But there again, I think the answer is fairly obvious. We already have groups of humans who don't work for a living. Take young children, for instance, who are economically completely useless and nevertheless seem in many cases to have great lives, maybe better lives than grown-ups. Many spend their days playing with their friends and making up games and learning, and so then maybe that would be the lot of all of us in this scenario where we didn't have to work for a living. I think it's true that there would be a fairly significant readjustment required for that of culture, of the education system. Like rather than training kids to become productive office workers where they sit at their desk and receive assignments that are graded, like this would make no sense. You could instead educate people to have a great life, to cultivate hobbies and appreciation for beauty and nature and conversational skills and physical wellness and all of these other things. But I think that could be done, and but I think there's like further layers to this onion. Once you reflect that in this condition of technological maturity, it wouldn't just be human economic labor that would become unnecessary, but a lot of other instrumentally motivated efforts also would be unnecessary. So right now, something that a person who doesn't have to work for a living might do, they might, maybe they decide, oh, I'm going to get fit, so I'm going to spend time in the gym to put in the work in the gym, and then I can feel, physically better afterwards, and mentally maybe clarity and relaxed or whatever. But in a solid world, you could pop a pill and achieve the same effect. So why sweat for an hour in the gym if you could achieve exactly the same effect by just taking a pill? Seems a lot more convenient. And you can work through different activities that currently people maybe envisage as activities they would fill up their leisure time with if they didn't have to work. And you can, for a lot of these activities, cross them, or at least put a question mark on top of them. Like you could still do these things in a solid world, but maybe they would seem a bit pointless. Like, why go to the gym if you could have exactly the same effects by popping a pill? Why, maybe you'd want to learn like higher mathematics that you never got around to when you were a student. And now you'd have time to finally, read that textbook on advanced algebra or whatever. But at technological maturity, I think there would be sort of sophisticated neurotechnologies that maybe could fine-tune your synapses so that you would, without effort, enter a state of knowledge and skill in this mathematical domain, and so on and so forth. So you would have not just this unprecedented control over the structure of matter in our surroundings, but also autopotency, the control over our own nature, our physiological states in the body and our mental states would come under our control. And so you would have this kind of condition of plasticity in a solid world. So then I think you have a much more profound question of what in that condition it would make sense for us to do. What life would we shape when freed from all these instrumental concerns? That is so much part of our sort of evaluative thinking. We've always been subject to all kinds of instrumental concerns from like way before we were even humans, right? And up until the present day. It's like almost like a carapace or an exoskeleton for a bug that they kind of, if you removed all of those instrumental concerns, like is this blobby thing inside? Like, do we just become amorphous pleasure blobs in that scenario, or is there more structure to our lives and our values? So those are some quite deep questions, like axiological questions, question about meaning and purpose and human value that the book dives
Yeah, you
into.
mentioned like a shallow redundancy, which is what a lot of people have already spoken about, like James Hughes at IEET and a bunch of transhumanists are focusing on what happens then. But what about the deep redundancy? What's the long-term prospects for humanity in a utopia? And you've mentioned like subtler values coming into focus once these, I've heard you say this phrase before, screaming imperatives don't dominate your attention as much anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm I'm ultimately optimistic about the kinds of modes of being that would become accessible. That some of those are extremely wonderful, but I do think it also this transition to a deep utopia will involve probably giving up some things that we currently think are fairly central to like what a good human life is like. And the book doesn't try to sell this kind of rosy ideal like to try to like convince the reader to become really excited about it. It's like more like diving into the, in some sense, repulsiveness of some of these visions. But then I think if you work through that, you can sort of rebuild something valuable. You have to go back almost to the basic constituents of our values and see how they can be instantiated and what kinds of instantiations make sense under these very different conditions. So you can read the book in two different ways. So for me, obviously, I think there's a real chance AI will actually, change the world, and we might confront some of these choices, what kind of life we want to have in a solved post-human condition. In reality, fairly maybe within the lifetime of people. I mean, if somebody doesn't think that, you could still read it just as a sort of a philosophical investigation into the nature of values, of human values, and like you could then view this construction of a solved world, these concepts more like as a philosophical particle accelerator. Like physicists create these very abnormal conditions where protons are smashed together at ridiculous energies, because even though these are exceptional circumstances, they reveal the basic constituents of matter. And you can then build models and extrapolate. And similarly with human values, their true nature sometimes maybe is discovered if you consider what these values imply about very unusual or extreme conditions. You can more easily identify their basic building blocks. And then you can maybe build models that you could extrapolate. And under normal conditions, like there are so many sort of contingent instrumental limitations and concerns that sort of block our view of what the ultimate principles are in our valuing. And so you could just, read it as a sort of philosophical investigation, but there's also a more practical agenda. I'm imagining that at some point, perhaps some humans will have to make some choices or decisions, like whether it's like some guys in a AI lab that have control, or maybe a government security apparatus elite, or like a worldwide deliberative process with representatives from all the different communities, or each person on their own, but somebody somewhere might need to form some opinions about what kind of future we actually want. Like that's like a daunting deliberation to go into. So I figured maybe it would be nice to have some sort of preparatory reading to peruse before you enter the big conference room. And this could be like maybe on that reading list. And so part of it is like, there are like specific concepts and clarifications and arguments and stuff that's like useful intellectual toolkit for being able to ask and then the right questions. Like sometimes the right question is like it's you have to chop your way through a lot of jungle even to get to the point where you can ask the right question. There are a lot of other questions that sort of are superficial or not really the right, like so there's a lot of intellectual work even to the point asking the deep questions. But then also beyond the specifics, I wanted to convey a spirit of this book. It's like how one might approach these in a spirit of generosity and playfulness and open-mindedness, while still maintaining sort of contact with a humane, rich, and in some sense locally grounded appreciation for what we are and our surroundings and friendships and values. Like, I think entering this hypothetical conference room where the fate of the world is decided with the right mindset might be quite key to what the result is. And so that's, which is part of the reason for why it's written in this sort of unusual way, rather than as a philosophical treatise, why it's more like a literature piece with these characters and stories and so forth.
Oh, and great characters. The story about Thermorex, which is absolutely hilarious. Didn't expect that. Yeah, I thought it was really good. But like you mentioned, taking the scenic route and avoiding just becoming ideal post-human forms from the get-go, as this is a possible pathway instead of like just exploring and experiencing the gradient from where we are now is like, cosmic infants to where we might become. We want to experience the journey. Why should we avoid rushing to become these ideal post-human forms?
Well, at least if we take the sort of standard model, as it were, of the universe, where we are here on Earth and there are all these planets and we have billions of years potentially if we get things right. There's a lot of time, right? So if we have billions, presumably trillions if you sort of measure it in subjective time, and if you sort of optimize the future of the light cone to maximize the serial depth of the computations we can perform or something like that. There's like this enormous space, and so if we have a pluralistic view of the values we want to realize, some of those might be more local and more connected to different states of being. That there might be certain things, I think, in fact, that our current human condition, as I alluded to earlier, that there would be this, you would have to give up some things to live in a souled world, as well as gain, hopefully a lot more. But certain things that might be quite valuable, that is kind of distinctive to living as a being with our current human limitations. And so since there is like so much time, you could satisfy a lot of these values. The post-human values, yes, maybe the vast majority of the time would be lived in some unimaginable post-human expanded state of being. But why not also make sure we sort of max out, or at least sort of, So it's like if you think of a computer game with many different levels. So imagine if there were like a cheat code you could just key in to get to the final level. And maybe the final level is like the best level in some sense. But you could, if you had unlimited time, if all the levels are good, you might want to sort of work your way through them and maybe do some side quests and stuff along the way. That's one reason for why we might not want to immediately snap our fingers and receive the maximum state, but like thinking instead of trajectories, like optimal trajectories. The other is that the structure of our values might not so much be, it might not supervene on states, and it might like human, like if you think of even like some prudential concern, like we are more sort of dynamic value processes rather than like a utility function. So that like the kind of values we will get over time, we might not already have, and we might want the values we get to develop in certain ways and according to certain criterions, and maybe depending on certain contingencies. Like you might want the person you value 100 years from now to depend on whom you meet in the intervening years and how your interactions with them and so on and so forth. And you might want your values to change in response to that. Like if you're not yet a parent and you are going to become a parent, you might want your values to change so that you then come to value your child for his or her own sake, even though before you have the child you might not value that being, but you might sort of want your values to change. That might be itself a value that we have now. And so in addition to this point about there being a lot of time and why not like try to reach through the whole portfolio of values, there is also this sense of a lot of values, particularly if you sort of open your aperture and allow yourself to consider more subtle or like quieter values that we might not currently have the luxury to really focus so much on, because we are lucky if we can like realize our main value in life and like. But in this condition of abundance, you could sort of let in subtler values, and there might be some of those that have more of the form of a sort of gradual unfolding and shaping and responding to contingencies. And allowing things to develop according to their intrinsic propensities and nature. That might also call for a sort of trajectory-based approach as their best form of realization, rather than an instantaneous transformation. Or just think of it as like a preservation of personal identity. So a lot of people care about themselves surviving, right? That's like a basic value. You don't want to die, not soon anyway. Now, if you were just suddenly tomorrow transformed into a planetary, like a Jupiter planet-sized superbrain, like that would be more questions. Is that still you? Like maybe this planetary superbrain remembers all the things that you remember, and there's like some, but maybe the planet brain would be more you if it resulted through a slow process of you growing into that thing as a result of a sequence of choices over 500 years. Let's say you figured out how to upgrade this, temporal lobe, and then you spent 2 decades figuring out how to like develop a different neural extension module, and then you made a choice and you practice this new skill. Like eventually you grow into that. That maybe like make the case that the end result is actually you stronger than if it were an instantaneous transformation, even if the end pattern were the same. Because like some conceptions of personal identity might also pay attention to the trajectory that led from the starting point to the end point. It might well be that our values are a little bit sort of are not premised on one specific view of metaphysics. Like to some extent, we come with these values without having worked out all the specific metaphysics or a perfect theory of personal identity or like a lot of other things. So it might well be that if you sort of project the actual values we have onto some very specific, ultimately correct, complete metaphysics, what it will look like in that metaphysics might be a sort of smeared out pluralistic cloud of different considerations. And that when you try to realize that, the shape will be a lot more organic than if we sort of started with this correct ultimate metaphysics and sort of had some simple principles that defined an axiology on it. I don't know if that's clear or not, but anyway, those are sort of reasons for suspecting. I mean, multiple reasons for suspecting that maybe, but I do think there is also an urgency at the same time. Like there's a lot of horrors that you'd probably want to end as quickly as I possibly can. And so like an initial rush to some sort of adequately good condition that where you can actually start enjoying life and stopping the dying and the various other tragedies of maybe various forms of amnesia or like permanent like that, and then get to that level where you can sort of exhale and relax your shoulder, and you're basically safe, and then you can sort of start on the slower, like now life is already like really great, and then you can sort of grow out from there.
You've got plenty of time for long reflecting upon what to do next or where to go, but you don't need to get it all done at once because there's basically close to unlimited time in the universe. Yes, but you mentioned getting rid of death and pain and stuff like that, and David Pearce makes a cameo in your book, Deep Utopia, and his character persuades you to focus more on hedonic valence. You mentioned a five ring defense, and hedonism is one of those rings, or but there's a number of others like experience, texture, autotelic activity, artificial purpose, and socio-cultural entanglement. Yeah, do you want to just give us a briefing on this, the varieties of ways in which people might be able to preserve meaning and purpose in a deeply redundant utopia?
Yeah, so the place in the dialectic where this happens is kind of after in the first few chapters you get to this deeper purpose this kind of deep redundancy and the purpose like what it seems like existence might be pointless in this condition, like everything is dissolved, all the normal constraints that give shape to human life, and so like you have to like imagine working your way through that point where you think this actually doesn't look appealing at all, this kind of solved world where we like what's the point, but then we can start to rebuild and look at some basic values that actually could be realized in a solved world, and that's where this five-ringed defense idea. Like, so the first is pleasure, or like hedonic well-being in the fullest and richest sense of the word, which certainly would be possible in a solved world, and not just possible. You could get this to extreme degrees, right? Like people could really, really enjoy and feel good and just cherish every moment of existence. This is like as a consequence of advanced neurotechnology. Whether it's like through genetic engineering or for pharmacology or presumably more actually direct ways of adjusting and nudging and altering the patterns of our instantiations that would be accessible with sufficiently advanced technology. So that's a big box that we can just put a giant check mark in right off the bat. And for many people, this would be not. I mean, there are like hedonism in its various forms is a minority, but a substantial minority view, I think, among moral philosophers or people who have thought through the ages about what ultimately has value, like pleasure and the absence of pain, like the sort of suffering well-being axis. Maybe that's all there is, but you could also realize other candidate values on top of that. So let's make sure we get that one, and then we can see what else can we also do. And then another one is this experience texture, as you said. Like, so no reason to restrict yourself to only feeling sort of dumb pleasure, but you could experience that pleasure in conjunction with experiences of great complexity or intrinsic value according to views that think that certain experiences has intrinsic value. Maybe the appreciation of beauty, for example. So you have this immense aesthetic appreciation, and that's like what your subjective enjoyment is connected to. You see these jaw-dropping forms of beauty and grace, and whether it's like musical logics or visual or like maybe other forms of beauty that we can't currently perceive. And our truths, like, the pleasure in understanding deep fundamental truths about the nature of reality, about physics, about other human beings. Some value systems would say that these are distinctive values on top of pleasure, but you could have both in a deep utopia. And so we can put a check mark in that too. And then we can realize there's no reason why we would have to be passive. Like, so you could imagine this kind of passive pleasure in aesthetic appreciation and understanding of beauties, but we could be active as well. There's no reason you couldn't do stuff. So maybe you're like doing you imagine something from some some dance-like thing where you're experiencing the pleasure and understanding like the beauty, or maybe it's a way more complex than that, like sort of more intellectual or things that take place over great spans of times. So you could add that activity. Where it gets a little bit more challenging is when it comes to certain values such as purpose, interestingness, novelty, meaning. There it is less immediately obvious that you could just sort of crank up to some extreme level the degree to which these values are instantiated in a deep utopia. I mean, in fact, at first sight, it seems like these values would be greatly imperiled, that you couldn't have, perhaps, a purpose, because there's nothing we need to do, you might think. You might think human existence would be meaningless. You might think it would be uninteresting to live in this world where you just snap your fingers and everything happens and there's no challenge, kind of. You might think novelty would be jeopardized as well, like at least after some period of time, right? Like you can only experience certain things for the first time once, and then if there is like a finite number of important things to experience, at some point you would run out of firsts. And so there we have to dive into more of a finer granularity of analysis and see. And I think there's like at least significant degrees to which versions or aspects or fragments of these values can be preserved and indeed instantiated in high degrees. Artificial purpose is the easiest. So if you think that there is value in doing things for the sake of achieving other things, we could still have that in Deep Utopia, namely by just giving ourselves certain goals that are designed in such a way that they can only be realized through our own efforts. So the paradigm case of this are various games that people, set yourself some random goal to achieve this, board state on a chess table, or maybe to get the ball into a sequence of 18 holes. There's no reason why you need to do this. But for whatever reason, let's suppose you do adopt that goal. Now you really want to achieve it. And moreover, let's say you define as part of the goal, not just that the ball has to go into the sequence of 18 holes, but that you're limited to a certain restricted set of means to achieve this. Namely, you can only hit the ball with a golf club. And in a solved world, you would add some additional limitations. Maybe you're only allowed to hit the ball with a golf club and without resorting to some sort of neurotechnological enhancement that would give you a perfect ability to immediately do holes in ones throughout the golf course, like sort of restrictions that limit how you can achieve this goal, such that you would need to rely on your own effort, the exertion of your own will and your own talents. Now, once you have adopted this goal, and you could use neurotechnology to motivate yourself to want to pursue this goal, that's a choice you could make, then this activity becomes possible. You have this artificial purpose, and the only way you can realize this goal you have adopted is through your own activity and your own effort. So now you have sort of purposeful activity, although the purpose is artificial. But at least you could add that as a possible ingredient. What about natural purpose? You might think these purposes are all well and fine, but it's not quite the same to do something because you just arbitrarily set yourself a goal. Right now, there are a lot of things we need to do, we really need to do, because, otherwise bad things happen. And they're not just bad because we randomly decided to want them not to happen. We already, so you have to go to work every day because otherwise you don't get a paycheck, and if you don't get a paycheck, eventually you get kicked out of your flat, and then eventually you live on the street and it's really cold, and so there's like a real independent of you and your decision reason for doing this. So these natural purposes might be in scarcer supply in a solved world. I think nevertheless there might be some that could survive this transition to technological maturity, and a lot of those would have the form of various kind of social, cultural entanglements that you might care about what other people want, and maybe what those people want is that certain things are done by you as opposed to done by some robot. Or they might take the form of values you have, like to honor various traditions, and the only way to honor a tradition is for you actually to do certain things yourself. Like it wouldn't count as honoring a tradition if you sort of just told the robot to go off and do the ceremonial remembrance or whatever. Religious and spiritual values might also give rise to natural purposes that would survive automation. And so that also is then maybe to a more limited extent perhaps than currently, but still to a non-zero extent, values natural purposes. Like to the extent that achieving and working towards natural purposes is intrinsically valuable, there might be some extent to which that too is possible in a solved world. And I make the point of the dilation of our evaluative pupils. So it might be that a lot of these natural purposes that would survive some of them might now strike us as kind of almost frivolous or sentimental, or like, yeah, it's nice to value your ancestors, but like, right now we have so many more important things to do, perhaps, you think. But in this scenario, I point out where all of these other things are already taken care of, it might be completely appropriate to place more weight on the remaining subtler, quieter values. Just like when you walk outside at night, it makes sense for your pupils to dilate, to take in more of the light. And then you can see that actually is this whole canopy, this starry sky that was there all along. It's just that during the day you couldn't see it because the sort of immediate pressing intensity of the sun blotted it out. But it's not like you have to invent new stars, like they are there all along. And once like the urgent screaming moral imperatives and needs are taken care of, these more subtle constellations can come into view and give us reasons for doing things. So that's, I guess, a sort of thumbnail sketch of some of the argumentation.
Yeah. I've had a renewed appreciation for subtlety. I'm in Japan at the moment, and they have the Ikagai concept, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, which is how to generate meaning and purpose in life. Now that might need to be revised as we move into a utopia, if we move into a utopia. But yes, they certainly do appreciate subtlety in the foods, and also, they have the ancestor worship as part of the Shinto tradition. So it's really quite lovely being part of that. And so actually revising this book again has been a real pleasure in this environment here in Japan. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the space there is enormous. And I mean, so all the spirituality and religion, but then even just poetry, like, is a kind of way of increasing your sensitivity to a lot of what would strike us otherwise as completely mundane and worthless, like a pile of dirty clothes on a laundry room floor or something like that. Viewed in the right way and approached it can contain within itself sort of realms of beauty and being that we don't have the luxury or maybe even the sensibility to really appreciate. But it's there, and you can cultivate that to a certain extent in our current incarnation. But you could imagine in this very different condition that could be taken to degrees that would just kind of completely astound us if we could catch a little glimpse of the kinds of experiences that would be possible there. Like, they might be so wonderful and breathtakingly beautiful and just striking that it would just seem like we had been hardly even conscious before. like not even sleepwalkers, but some sort of dull glimmer of a little hunger sometimes, and a little ambition sometimes, and a little whatever other fear of public speaking, like this, but like not really, like it's a kind of, a ringworm level of consciousness relative to what these post-human minds might encompass, these kind of vast, also scintillating seas of astonishing, beautiful truths that they inhabit. So I think we should be humble about, I said earlier about like this AI in the larger space, but also about our current ability to sort of grasp what is at stake and how things could be. I think we have very feeble conscious minds. They are very small and can't really contain very much of reality, and I think, so that's, we can understand it in abstract terms, but I don't think we can understand it in sort of at any kind of real intuitive level.
Oh, look, reading this book has really helped me to appreciate some of this, the depth and subtlety of values that I'm not aware of. It's not, on at top of mind in my everyday life. It's nice to be able to sort of read about this. This book is really good. For anybody who's not really interested in utopia per se, this book's great for just exploring how to approach meaning and purpose in just life. There's so many bits in this book which is really interesting. But is talking about interesting, is interestingness important? You've got four hypotheses there. You've got learning and exploration, the signaling hypothesis, the spandrel hypothesis, and the rut avoidance hypothesis. So, it's just a real breakdown of what makes interestingness interesting, really. Have you got anything to say about that?
Yeah, so I think it's a plausible ingredient in a lot of values that people might have and that they might fear would be lacking in a solved world. Part of what would make it repugnant to have such a condition of the world that it would seem to be uninteresting in some intuitive sense. Like it's like already things are already solved. You can be whatever, and it's like you're just playing these games, and it's not like. And so analyzing that value itself then becomes relevant, and it also is a little bit subtle and complicated. Like some of the others, like the point about pleasure that we talked about earlier is, I think, very important. Maybe it's the only thing that matters, or maybe it's the most important thing. But theoretically, it's pretty simple. Like you just realize you have this advanced neurotechnology, like subjective well-being is a kind of function of the organization of neural activity. You could control the neural activity. You could have like very high levels of subjective well-being. There's not that much more to be said about it on an intellectual. It's an important point, but it's relatively simple and sort of intellectually not that fascinating to elaborate on. So, but whereas interestingness is there's a lot more sort of complexity to the concept. First of all, we have to distinguish between objective and subjective interestingness to sort of get an obvious confusion out of the way. Some people might think, oh, it would be boring to live in this perfect world. Like I'd be like fascinated the first week or something, but after that I'd just be bored all the time. Now clearly that's not the case if you mean subjectively bored, because that's a mental state that neurotechnology could easily modify away. So in fact, you could feel extremely fascinated and like with rapt attention and enormously invested and motivated and whatever other antonyms of boredom you might conceive of. Those would be easily realizable. So to the extent that there is a challenge of interestingness, it's got to be a different, not the subjective notion of interestingness as a mental state, but like interestingness as some sort of objective property of certain situations or lifestyles, where you might say that even if somebody were subjectively super interested in counting blades of grass on a lawn, that's all they wanted to do with their life, and they were like obsessively focused on this and found great joy in it, that nevertheless you might judge there's this objective notion of interestingness in which their lives lack it. Like it's just too simple and monotonous and repetitive an activity to have this objective quality of interestingness. You might doubt that there is such a notion of objective interestingness, that it's all just subjective, but I think some of our value intuitions come from this idea that there is like something lacking in the grass counter's life. And so then you can analyze, and it would take us probably too far afield to really dive into it in detail, but what such a notion of objective interestingness might consist in, and the degree to which that might or might not be realizable in a solved world. So one element might be novelty, that might be one component of what makes something interesting. Like just doing the same thing over and over again might be sort of objectively uninteresting, no matter what the thing is.
Table legs.
Sorry, table
carving,
legs.
Pierre carving table legs.
Vignette. So then you can analyze, what is this novelty? Like, is it like something that it's only the first time something is done that it can be interesting? Well, then, like, if you take that literally, like our current lives got to be pretty uninteresting. If you live in a big enough universe, everything has already been done exactly to like the precise molecular configuration. And so if that's the criterion, then Deep Utopia would be uninteresting, but then our current lives are also just as uninteresting, and at least we wouldn't be any worse off in that regard. So then you think, well, maybe that's not the sense in which something has to be novel. It's like, maybe it's like just has to be novel within our society, or maybe within our own life. And then you can zoom in and look more specifically at that, like how do you measure this kind of novelty? Like there is a sense in which our current lives have their maximum amount of novelty just in the first couple of years of life, where there are these like fundamental cognitive revolutions, like you discover that there are objects. Like that's a pretty profound realization, right? Or that other people exist. Like, wow. And then like later in life, it's like, in the average year, there is no equivalently large revelation that occurs to you. On the other hand, like each year now, maybe, or each day now, you have much more complex thoughts that maybe are more interesting in some other sense. Like each new thought is like, highly refined and clever, that builds on decades of study and understanding. So then depending on precisely how you sort of explicate this notion of interestingness, you get different answers, and you can have different kinds of interestingness. Anyway, I think the upshot is that, there might be some forms of that we will be at risk of running out of, and so we might want to sort of conserve some of those. I speak of little mysteries lovingly preserved in jars, like a little, rather than immediately finding out everything, and we might want to save some discoveries for later on to have like some of that kind of novelty as well. So, I mean, I don't know why we need to go to the bottom of every ocean and catalog every deep sea creature. Like, isn't it cool if there is like some mystery, like where some sea monsters could dwell? I don't know. But in any case, it's... So that's probably the chapter where kind of people who like analytic philosophy might enjoy it, but for other people, it might be more demanding, or sort of work your way through all of these little distinct stuff like that. But you have to take the rough with the smooth.
I really appreciated some of the later chapters. They do get quite philosophically heavy, and all the Metzinger's stuff, and incredible book. So look, there's I guess putting the picture together, if we wanted to do a call to action. If we know that deep redundancy could lead to stagnation, nihilism, and a loss of meaning and purpose, what should we be doing right now to ground the talk? As individuals, as a society, as AI researchers, as policy creators, as people in sort of future planning departments, to ensure that graceful and fault-tolerant transition into a future where meaning, challenge, and purpose are still possible.
Yeah, so I don't have one big grand answer to that. I have views about a lot of little detailed specific things. That, I mean, yeah, maybe we should provide DNA synthesis as a service and have know your customer requirements in case there are discoveries in biotechnology that makes it easier to design really nasty pathogens and stuff. Then maybe you would want to be able to control the ability to synthesize these things. So literally, like far removed from this conception, but there's like a ton of little things like that that might, on the margin, improve our odds in various different ways in AI and in other fields. I think, broadly speaking, with AI, I think we might have to sort of what do they say in China? They like they feel our stones as we traverse the river or something like that. That rather than coming up with a detailed plan and blueprint in advance, we'll have to kind of feel our way through this and make adjustments as we go along, and new opportunities come into view. And particularly with respect to the more, I don't know, political aspects of what it makes sense to push for, and which AI developer to favor and which not, and whether to get governments more involved or less involved. I feel that it's hard to have like a firm, fixed opinion on that. It feels more like something that needs to be navigated rather than designed. But I do think, like, again, this overall attitude is still significant. I think, like, ultimately this transition to the superintelligence era is one we should do. It would be in itself an existential catastrophe if we forever failed to develop superintelligence, but that it will be associated with significant existential risks, and we should be careful. And but I feel like, yeah, I'm mostly thinking on the margin of, is there like little things here or there you can do that seem constructive and that improve the chances of a broadly cooperative future where a lot of different values can be like respected, and if not maximized, at least get like some fair chunk that kind of can be acceptable to a wide set of interests and stakeholders and value systems. I think those are more robustly likely to be good than if you sort of go out on a limb in some sort of highly confrontational or. But I do, yeah, I don't feel I have like a very clear policy platform to advocate for at this point.
It'd be great if we could get to the stage where we could still experience the, I guess, the thrill of solving important problems and forging our way into the future. Like you mentioned this in your book, Outriders, right? Where AI, if we can get superintelligence to sort of smooth out the sharp edges of the possible future light cone, and so we're existentially secure, we don't go extinct, and maybe longevity is solved and all those sorts of things, then we can still sort of forge our way. We don't need to worry so much, but we can still have that thrill of being sort of pseudo vanguards.
Potentially, that's one, yeah. If that has, but I would also say, like, to the extent that purpose is like your thing, that you say, like, now is the golden era of purpose, right? Like right now in the world around us, there is like so much need, so many horrible problems, so much opportunity to shape and influence things, that if purpose is what you want, like, knock yourself out today. Like, eventually, if things go well, like, the big problems will already have been solved. And so take advantage, like, make hay while the sun shines. If you want purpose, there is like, yeah, like the most abundant buffet laid out in front of you, and you just have to go to it.
Yes, it'd be awesome to hear you and Dave have a discussion at some stage. It is, I mean, you both co-founded the World Transhumanist Association in the late 90s, I believe, or early
Yeah, in
2000s,
some
going back
different
then.
era. Uh,
Yeah.
it, it feels like a different, a different age.
Hmm.
But yeah, no, that's He's great. There's been a big influence.
Well, it's been amazing talking to you again after all these years. It's been 12 years, 13, geez, since we did our first interview. Yeah, yes, I
Too
mean,
long.
it's been a wild ride, and I'm sure it's going to be even wilder in the following years. So I really appreciate you going over time. I do appreciate you've probably got things to do, and you're on the frontier of solving important problems. So yeah, uh,
Well,
I fully applaud your dedication and your effectiveness at doing what you've done. Written some amazing books. Future of Humanity Institute, while it existed, had such a huge impact. I'm thoroughly looking forward to what you do in the future as well.
thank you, Adam. It's very nice talking to you, and thanks for all your kind words as well, and the attention you've given to the book and some of the other stuff. I do appreciate that.
Well, it deserves it, really. Yeah. So that's it's been amazing.
Well, look, I enjoyed our conversation, and that yeah, it was good.